On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the May 2nd, 2022 edition of What the Ship, Top 5 Maritime Stories. I'm your host, Al Mercoglano. Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the What the Ship edition. So a lot to get to, going to jump right into it. But before we do that, two quick updates on previous stories. One, the museum ship USS The Sullivans up in Buffalo, New York, that had sunk at the pier has been raised. Repairs have been done to patch the hull, and continuing efforts are ongoing to complete the repairs so that to put that vessel back to its original state. Again, they're still looking for donations and efforts, and I'll have information in the show notes for that. Another story we had earlier this week was about the K.E. Barker, a large bulker that ran aground off Muskegon, Michigan. That vessel has also been freed and has now continued its voyage. It actually sailed into Muskegon not too long ago and is back in service as we speak. So before we jump into the 5 stories, if you're new to the channel, take a minute, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's jump to story number 1. So story number 1 takes us to our big kind of macro look at global shipping. And a couple of key stories that I thought really attracted the attention was this one, particularly right here from Bloomberg. The way we look at the global economy needs to change. This article was really, I got to say, the intro is what caught me more than anything else. Global supply chains are knotting up from China to Denmark, sparking re-examination of things as macro as globalization itself and micro as trucking efficiency around American ports, big issue that Craig Fuller over at FreightWaves has been talking about. As for the big picture, the intertwined world economy took decades to stitch together and will take years to play out. However, it evolves. In the meantime, economists are squinting to see the more granular short-term shifts that the pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine are forcing on consumption, investment, production, and trade. And I think that's true. We're looking at so many factors here that are interacting with global trade that it's really hard to kind of figure this out. Some observers say now is a good time to focus on different metrics than the traditional measures of unemployment or employment, prices, and gross domestic product. Those 3 things: employment, prices, GDP, what everyone tends to look at. The way we look at the global economy needs to change, said Stephen Barrow, a currency strategist at Standard Bank. No longer should we look at growth, inflation, and monetary policy through the lenses of demand. Instead, it is supply that's key, which is really an issue. When we start talking about grain, fuel, and China's lockdown, you'll see what I mean. Before the pandemic, the supply of goods and services was what economists would generally call elastic, flexible, easily to match demand. But now supply has turned from being elastic to inelastic, meaning that the response to changes in demand are far less. So I think that's summarization, and there's more here in this article. And again, I really recommend you take a look at it. I think it's a really interesting one to put in context the way the global maritime trade is beginning to change. We're shifting from demand to supply. And we're seeing that in several areas across. Just to give you a couple of pieces to this puzzle that I saw over the week, 2 stories dealing with the canals. Here's one from Greg Miller: how war, shipping boom, China lockdown impacted the Panama Canal. What is changing in ships going through the Panama Canal over the last year? And actually has this chart here, a really great little chart here, which I'll open up here so you can take a look at here in a little bit more detail. Shrink it down here so you can see it in some detail. Oops, sorry. There we go. Here you see it, and he's comparing basically the first half of 2021 to 2022. And what you're seeing right here is the big change. So general cargo is up, LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, is up, tankers is up, container ships is up. What's down? Dry bulk is down, vehicle carriers down, LNG demonstrably down. That has a lot to do with LNG going to Europe, vice to Asia right now. Same thing over in the Suez Canal. We're seeing Suez Canal records highest monthly revenue in April. Egypt's Suez Canal reached its highest monthly revenue to date in April, reaping $629 million in ship transit fees. Now, I will mention a couple of things here. Number one, Suez Canal has jacked up their rates twice now over the past year. So we're definitely seeing the rates go up, but we're still seeing an increase in traffic. Total number of ships that pass through the waterway that links the Red and Mediterranean seas increased by 6.3% from a year ago to 1,929 vessels. It was usually right around 1,800 vessels going through the canal during a period of time, and now we're up to 1,900 vessels going through. And again, this has a lot to do with the movement of goods, also has to do with the size of vessels going through. Finally, this last point, Chinese COVID policies to squeeze flow of European exports to North America. So last week's What the Ships Cover was a fully loaded container terminal. Here is a fairly empty container terminal in Shanghai. This story is really interesting because it looks, it's a Lorianne Larocco story, looks at empty containers. And the fact that the slowdown in Asia right now, the closing of Shanghai and a few other ports, is meaning that there's going to be insufficient empty containers in Europe because you're not having the full containers arrive in Europe being offloaded. They're slowing down. So you're not bringing these empties in. Those empties are taken, packed with goods and shipped over to the United States. And now they're not going to be able to be shipped. And one of the things we're seeing here is really this repositioning of vessels and containers around the world. We got ships piling up off the east coast of Asia. We're seeing that here in the anchorage off of Ningbo. And this is having an impact worldwide. So obviously what we're seeing here is on the macro scale, the global economy is in a lot of flux because of the global recession that we're seeing, because of China, because of inflation, because of Russia, Ukraine, you name it. There's a slew of issues all at play here. So that was story number one. Now for story number two. So we've all experienced the issue with gas and diesel at the pumps. If you've been to fuel your car, truck, whatever you have recently, you've seen prices spike, start to come back down and back up again. And the reason for that is everybody wants to blame everybody for this, but one of the reasons has to do with this. This story right here, a Bloomberg story, EU to propose phasing out Russian oil by the end of the year. One of the things we're seeing is a huge demand being put right now out there by the European Union for fuel, for gas, for diesel, for everything. And if they're serious about trying to phase this out by the end of the year, they're going to have to stockpile a lot of fuel at this time. At the same time, coincidentally, you're seeing stories like this. Dutch dock workers refused to unload tanker carrying Russian oil. There was an Indian-owned vessel that came in that has been jumping around from port to port trying to offload, but dock workers are refusing to work this vessel. See the same thing happening in Spain, where Spain turned away a Maltese tanker citing Russian transshipment. No one wants to touch Russian fuel at this point because of the war in Ukraine. And a lot of that Russian oil was being used in Europe and other places. And now that oil has to be replaced either from the Middle East or from the United States, which is ramping up demand, which is raising prices up. And one of the things you see in this next story is that exact issue right here. Reuters story, most of Europe's crude supply is coming from deep in the heart of Texas. And so we're seeing U.S. crude exports climbing. U.S. crude exports to Europe climbed in March and April as buyers across the Atlantic snapped up the country's light sweet grades to offset the expected loss of Russian oil, according to shipping data traders and analysts. So a lot of American oil is heading overseas to Europe to fill the basically the backfill the potential loss of oil coming out of Russia. Again, the EU is talking about cutting it off at the end of the year, but there are some countries that have already cut it off. And now they have to scramble to find those sources, and this is what you see. At the same time that Russian oil is being sanctioned and not going off, you have this story. From BIMCO, Russia to China crude tanker trade has nearly doubled. The amount of crude oil going to China, China is gobbling up this oil as quick as it can. So as other countries, India, others in Asia which are not worried about sanctions against Russia, are just getting it as fast as they can. But there are issues associated with this. Oil coming out of the Black Sea, for example, comes out in these what's called Aframax ships. These are kind of medium-sized tankers, anywhere from 80 to 120,000 tons. Medium-sized tankers, they're not built for long range. They're built to kind of shuttle fuel around. And then what usually happens is that oil that comes out of the Black Sea is sent to an anchorage or a facility, either off Greece or Italy, to be consolidated into bigger tankers and then sent across to Asia or to the Americas. Well, that's not being done. And this article kind of deals with that. Tankers using costly or smaller tankers to move Russia oil to China. So these traders that are using these costly or small tankers are having to pay more because they're moving oil in smaller tankers and not using the really big VL and ULCCs to move oil efficiently in these large areas. And that's also escalating the cost. So when you look at oil today and why your gas prices are going up, you've got the issue because of the EU, you've got demand in Europe for American oil, the refusal to use Russian oil, and then even the Russian oil is in such big demand that its prices are going up, but the transportation of it is expensive because you have to move it in smaller vessels. Again, every time we think we start to come out of these crises a little bit, something else materializes. So that was story number 2. Let's jump over to story number 3. Story number 3, food. Food is going to be the big issue looming in 2022. Now, let me be clear. Number one, you're not going to face food shortages in the United States or in many Western countries. Let's be clear about that. What you're going to experience is higher food costs. But in certain countries around the world, we may see food shortages really kick in because we get a couple of issues coming out of the Black Sea, Ukraine-Russia war. You're losing grain shipments out of Ukraine. You're seeing the slow and disrupted nature of grain shipments out of Russia. Now that Mariupol looks like it's going to fall and has been neutralized, you're seeing the flow of goods down the Don through the Sea of Azov out into the Black Sea. However, we're seeing the escalation of war on the Black Sea, and we could see attacks against commercial shipping. I'm not going to rule that out. But one of the things that we're also seeing is the lack of fertilizer coming out. And even though some in the Biden administration and some other people are out there sitting there saying this is not an issue, it's a huge issue. You need fertilizer for soil. I mean, you just do. Again, it's great to go natural and not to use fertilizer, but we went from 1 billion people on this planet in the year 1800 to 7.5 billion people today. And the reason we did that is 2 reasons. Number one, a lot of sex. But number 2, we had a lot of food, and you can't have 7.5 billion people on the planet if you don't have food. And a lot of that food came through new technologies in food production. It came through the establishment of certain crops that can grow in certain environments, but also because of fertilization that allows the crops to grow. Actually, fertilization deal with that first thing too, but that's a whole different subject. But anyway, you need those things. And if you don't get that food production, you're going to start seeing potential food shortages around the planet. Again, since the 14th century, world population has done nothing but increased. Even the worst wars in our history, World War I, World War II, you don't see world population decrease. Since the 14th century, since the Black Death, we've seen world population increase. But now we're talking about food shortages, and food shortages are huge. This story right here, first ship of Ukrainian corn departs Romania. This is corn that's been shipped over the border to Romania from Ukraine and loaded on a ship. Now, a couple of things about this. Number one, this is really difficult to do because Ukraine and Europe's railways don't match. They're different gauges. The widths are different. Ukraine has the old Soviet gauge. Europe is on the European gauge, so you just can't drive tracks. You got to cross connect them and offload them or move the backs off the tracks, which is really difficult. But even then, you're only moving about 80,000 tons, which is just loaded with 71,000 tons of Ukrainian corn. That's not a lot in terms of what Ukraine typically exports. This is a drop in the bucket. Second, the issue with commodity traders. Great story here by Barry Parker, really going into the inside nature of how these commodity traders are dealing with these issues. Secretive, crafty, and utterly necessary. They're the ones who are going to be moving these commodities around the world. And his article is really great to understand that. But then you get this story over here from Lodestar. U.S. perishable shippers are struggling to keep their markets alive. And basically one of the issues they're dealing with is the fact that, again, go back to those big container carriers on the West Coast of the United States. They don't want to take American exports. It said last year that more than 20% of confirmed U.S. export agricultural sales were lost due to carrier issues and excessive pricing, with as much as 40% of export bookings requests declined by ocean carriers at the first attempt. The lines canceled 31% of confirmed export bookings. All right. This is the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. This is the thing that the World Shipping Council is fighting against because they don't want to take U.S. exports in those empty containers because they want to bring those empty containers back to Asia, pack them with goods, and send them back across at the higher freight rate. If you send a container loaded with grain over, it's got to be offloaded, it's got to be moved, it's out of circulation a bit longer. This is the problem, and goes back to the FMC's investigation. Carl Bensel, one of the commissioners, talking about how China has monopolized container production, chassis production, and now the ocean carriers don't want to do this. This is a problem. This is a huge problem that the FMC is trying to deal with. And it's one of the reasons why you just saw this week a request by the FMC for more funding so they can better investigate this. This is going to kick, excuse me, ocean reform into high gear because of actions like this by the World Shipping Council and the major ocean carriers. Add to it, you're starting to see countries enact food protectionism, which is going to impact exports. Indonesia's palm oil export ban kicked off Thursday in one of the most dramatic cases of food protectionism since the war erupted in Ukraine. Top shippers imposed a sweeping ban on cooking oil exports, covering palm oil products across the value chain. It's hard to overstate the importance of the tropical oil as it's found everywhere today: food, soap, lipstick, and even printing ink, which makes Indonesia move important for the world. Again, not high on everybody's radar, but when you kick in food protectionism, it's going to create countries to lock down their exports, not allow food out, and that has ramifications all the way down the supply chain. So again, food is going to become this critical issue that we're going to see throughout the upcoming year. All right, let's jump over to story number 4. Story 4 deals with shipping costs. And this is a story from the International Monetary Fund from Kim Willis over at FreightWaves, talking about rising ocean shipping costs to bring wave of higher prices. The IMF research confirms higher 2021 shipping costs could increase inflation by about 1.5 percentage points in 2022. And again, one of the things we're not seeing is really the dramatic drop off in freight rates that we initially saw. We saw them start to come down, but we haven't seen them plateau down to the level pre-COVID by any means whatsoever. And what that means is this is going to continue. A lot of this, I would argue, has to do with this story here, where the shippers are still favoring contracts despite short-term spot rate discounts. In other words, the people who are shipping cargo are still going with their long-term contracts. They're not jumping on the spot rate discounts that they currently see. They don't want to lose their spots and rates with the ocean carriers. So even though we're seeing spot rates come down, we're seeing that kind of fall, we're seeing that the shippers are still continuing with them. Also add this story here by Zentia's CEO Berglund. It's a position of power the carriers have no desire to relinquish. Going here, April saw the third consecutive monthly climb in long-term contracted ocean freight rates, with shipping costs rocketing by 11.1% globally to stand 109.9% up year on year. The data revealed in the latest Zentia shipping index demonstrates how supply chain demand, successful carrier strategies, and continued COVID disruptions in China are coalescing to pile on the pain for shippers worldwide. Go down here. European developments led the change in April as the import benchmark surged 16.8%, while export rates climbed 20.3% over the month. At the same time, Far East moves were less pronounced, with imports edging up 0.8%, exports jumping 9%, a staggering 127.7% year-on-year end of appreciation. In the United States, the import index also rose by 9%. And so what we're seeing here is a shift. Zentia CEO talked about this. Where's that? Here it is. That is hitting exports, which can obviously free up capacity, put pressure on spot rates. However, proactive carriers are moving to protect their dominant positions, as we can see with the 2M alliance Aiming to blank, that means cancel. 3 Far East North European sailings in May. They are not alone in this response to what is in these times a rare crack in otherwise solid market fundamentalism. And what we continue to see here is they are aiming to keep these rates up high, but at the same time, one of the things we're seeing too is a kind of an uptick a bit in their reliability, as this story talks about. Schedule reliability improves again in March. This is the chart here. And one of the things you see here in this figure one, 2018 is in blue, 2019 is in orange, and in green is 2020. So you come off those peak years, great reliability, up around 70, 80%. And then all of a sudden in 2020, the green line takes that nosedive down. And the red line, 2021, you're hovering between 30 and 40%. And now 2022, you're starting to see the uptick. You're starting to see it come up. But at the same time, too, notice how the average delays for late vessel arrivals is literally at the highest it's been, almost 8 days. Now it's starting to come down, and that's the big issue. Is the reliability starting to come up? Are we losing those delays? But again, we're still seeing backlogs. If I pulled up the numbers for LA, for example, there's still 40 ships waiting off LA. We're seeing an uptick in the dwell time for containers that had went down, now coming back up again, and we're still awash with empties. So again, I think when we look at global shipping costs, obviously there are a lot of factors at play here. And I think that freight rates, while they came down off the mega high they were at, they haven't taken that dive down that we're seeing with trucking rates, for example. Will that happen? I don't think so. I actually don't think so, because I think the container carriers are not going to allow that to happen. They're going to start scrapping tonnage. They're going to start removing ships from service that are running that they don't need anymore, that they've been keeping operational just because of the demand. So we're definitely going to see some issues coming out with global shipping. All right, let's go to our last story for today. Last story today, I go to my tried and true bud, John Conrad, over at G Captain, who has been on this YouTube channel with me many times before. John had this story out the other day. Top Navy Admiral wants rust-free ships. This is an image of the USNS Alan Shepard, what's known as a logistics support vessel. For those who don't know, 1 out of every 5 ships in the U.S. Navy are manned by civilian merchant mariners. Mariners operate mostly their logistic auxiliary ships, tankers, oilers, supply vessels, ammunition ships, tugs, you name it. But this is one of them, and that ship looks pretty hard run right there. That ship is fairly new, just less than 10 years old. But one of the things that we've been seeing is this growing issue about rust on Navy vessels, appearance. And let me be clear, rust on ships is as old as iron has been. But a lot of this has gotten really, really out of control. And John makes a point in the story to talk about this, quoting the Chief of Naval Operations, that rust-free ships are critical for deterrence and naval readiness. Yet when you look at these ships, they look pretty bad. This is a tweet here by Chris Cavus, who runs a great podcast, the Cavus Ships podcast on U.S. Navy. I've been on it myself. It's great. Here's a picture of the James Williams arriving at Navy Station Mayport, looking pretty worse for wear after having been deployed to the 4th Fleet. But one of the things, too, I should mention is that these aren't just the image of ships coming back from deployment. If you see them going out to deployment, they're pretty bad, too. And this is an issue of readiness and deterrence. And, you know, one of the things that a buddy of mine, Blake Hertzinger, says in this post here, doing the work of 3 ships with the maintenance time of half a ship looks great, Navy, let's keep it up. I mean, that's true. I mean, these ships, there's about 30 of these ships, and they have to support 300 ships. And so that issue comes to bear here. What does this mean? This means that, number one, U.S. shipyards are at capacity, and there's not enough room to bring ships in for needed maintenance or repairs. Why is Madeline Waltzko and the crew of the MV President Wilson stuck in a shipyard in Shanghai? It's because shipyards are full. There's no shipyards available for them. We're not learning lessons from the commercial side, how commercial ships with crews of 30 can keep their vessels looking fairly good. It's money, it's the correct paint, It's using those shipyard periods to apply it correctly, and it's upkeep by logistics teams that come on board when the ship is docked. And so one of the things we're seeing here is the degradation of the Navy. And I think this is an important element when the newest, stealthiest super destroyer of the US Navy, the USS Zumwalt, looks like that. That's not really indicating a lot of great power projection. I am finishing up my video. I know I've talked about this a lot and everyone's been asking me about it, but understand this video. I want to make sure I do it right, because I'm going to anger a few people when I do my video on the Bonhomme Richard fire. But you know, you need to do things right, because it's not just a matter of whether your destroyer can shoot off missiles and guns and helicopters and whatever. It's also appearance. It's also, you want to create an image, and not sure this is the exact image you want with it. Matter of fact, the Admiral Gilday was asked about this at the end, and it's creating frustration. John, at the very last part of this video, talked to a officer in the Military Sea Lift Command, one of the deck officers in the Military Sea Lift Command. And this is what he said: dude, come on, you're going to post that photo of Shepard to G Captain? Goes on, I literally had the Commodore, the head of the MSC area, knocking on my gangway, asking me why the, let you fill in the word here, was rusty. These posts just trickle down to the ship's chief mate, who are already overwhelmed. And that's the problem here, is these get pushed down to the ship, and it's really not the ship's fault, because there are limitations put on Navy and civilian crews on Navy vessels that prohibit them from going over the side, chipping, scraping, painting, you name it. And again, this is all part of projection of naval and maritime power. If you look like crap, people will think you are crap, and that is true. You would not send Marines out, or Army personnel, or Air Force personnel, or anyone out looking like crap. You get their uniform squared away and you make sure. And it should be the same for Navy ships. I know it doesn't sound like much, but understand it's an important element. When we talk about the Great White Fleet, it was white for a reason, because they wanted to demonstrate the impression of the vessel. It wasn't the, the Great Navy fleet that went around. It was the White Fleet. It was meant to do that, and white was difficult to keep up. It's important to remember that was 100 years ago, 110 years ago, that they did it, but it was really the entrance of the United States onto the world stage. I think the Great Gray Rusty Fleet doesn't quite have the ring of the Great White Fleet. Hope you enjoyed this week's What the Ship. If you did, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll learn about new videos as they come out. Leave a message, give it a thumbs up, share it across social media, and if you can, support the channel via our Patreon page. There's a link to Patreon right here at the end of the video and down in the show notes. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.